To master your thoughts before the world influences them is to claim sovereignty over the only domain that is truly yours. The mind, unguarded in the early hours, is susceptible to the incursions of distraction, anxiety, and borrowed opinions. It is a territory that, if left undefended, will be swiftly occupied by the noise of others, by their fears, their ambitions, their judgments, and their trivialities. Morning meditation stands as the sentry at the gate, ensuring that the first impressions stamped upon your consciousness are chosen, deliberate, and aligned with reason rather than impulse. When you awaken, you are not yet entangled in the obligations, provocations, and unpredictabilities of the day. Your consciousness exists in a rare state of clarity, unclouded by fresh grievances or immediate demands. This interval is not merely a pause between sleep and activity. It is a strategic vantage point from which you may survey the terrain of your own character. In this silence, you possess the unique opportunity to examine your thoughts as they arise, to sift through them with discernment, and to discard those that are unworthy of shaping your conduct. Most individuals surrender this precious interval without reflection. They reach immediately for stimulation messages, headlines, trivial amusements, and in doing so, they allow external forces to dictate the tone of their inner world. Their first emotions are reactions rather than decisions. Their minds are colonized by the concerns of strangers before they have even recalled their own principles. Such a habit breeds dependence and instability. For a mind that begins the day in submission will struggle to assert independence when adversity arrives. To master your thoughts is not to suppress them, but to interrogate them. Each idea that surfaces in the morning deserves scrutiny. Ask, is this thought useful or merely habitual? Does it fortify my character or does it weaken my resolve? Is it grounded in reality or in fear of events that have not yet occurred? Through such questioning, you transform from a passive recipient of mental impressions into an active curator of your own consciousness. This practice requires a level of intellectual austerity that many find uncomfortable. The mind, by nature, gravitates toward ease. It prefers familiar patterns, even when those patterns are detrimental. It will replay old grievances, rehearse imagined catastrophes, and indulge in fantasies of recognition or revenge. Left unchecked, these tendencies form a labyrinth of unproductive rumination, draining your energy before the day has even begun. Morning meditation interrupts this cycle by imposing structure upon the formless stream of thought, compelling the mind to justify its preoccupations. Consider the implications of beginning each day without this discipline. You rise, and before you have oriented yourself, you are confronted with a cascade of information. News of conflict, images designed to provoke envy, opinions crafted to incite outrage. Each of these stimuli implants itself within your awareness, subtly steering your mood and your expectations. By the time you step into your responsibilities, you are already reacting defensive, agitated, or distracted, without ever having consciously chosen this state. In this way, the untrained mind becomes a puppet, its strings pulled by whatever spectacle happens to cross its path first. Mastery of thought in the morning reverses this dynamic. Instead of being shaped by the day's first impressions, you shape them. You establish your priorities before the world attempts to impose its own. You remind yourself of the values that define you: integrity, patience, rationality, and you rehearse them as one would rehearse a vital skill. This rehearsal is not an abstract exercise. It is a preparation for the very real provocations you will encounter. By preemptively aligning your thoughts with your principles, you reduce the likelihood that you will betray them when tested. There is also a profound psychological advantage in beginning the day with intentional thought. When your first mental acts are chosen rather than accidental, you experience a sense of authorship over your own life. You are not drifting from one reaction to another. You are navigating according to a chart that you have drawn yourself. This fosters a quiet confidence, a stability that does not depend on the day unfolding according to your preferences. You have already established your internal order. External disorder cannot easily dismantle it. Furthermore, the discipline of examining your thoughts cultivates an acute awareness of their impermanence. In meditation, you observe how ideas arise, linger briefly, and then dissolve. You witness how emotions can surge without warning and then fade without consequence if left unentertained. This observation erodes the illusion that every thought is significant or deserving of obedience. You begin to recognize that many of your mental impulses are mere reflexes, echoes of past experiences or social conditioning rather than authoritative commands. With this recognition comes freedom, the freedom to choose which thoughts to nourish and which to starve. Language itself becomes an instrument in this mastery. The words you use internally shape the architecture of your perception. If your morning reflections are saturated with defeatist or resentful language, your mind will adopt a posture of defensiveness and scarcity. If, however, you articulate your intentions with precision and dignity, you reinforce a self-image rooted in capability and restraint. To tell yourself, "I must endure another burdensome day," is to invite reluctance and fatigue. To declare, "I am granted another day to exercise my character," is to invoke a sense of purpose and readiness. The events of the day may be identical in both cases, yet your experience of them will differ radically based on the linguistic framework you have chosen at dawn. Mastering your thoughts also entails acknowledging their To expect adversity and prepare your response is to acknowledge a fundamental truth of existence, that life unfolds, not according to personal preference, but according to an indifferent and often unpredictable order. Many suffer not because hardship is rare, but because they insist on believing that it should not occur to them. This illusion, though comforting in moments of ease, becomes a source of profound destabilization the moment reality diverges from expectation. The unprepared mind greets difficulty with shock, indignation, and confusion, as though the universe has committed a personal offense. A disciplined mind, however, anticipates resistance in the same way a seasoned mariner anticipates storms. It does not wait for the first violent wave to begin reinforcing the hull. It fortifies the vessel while the waters are still calm. In the quiet of morning meditation, one rehearses the inevitability of obstacles, delays, betrayals, misunderstandings, loss, and fatigue. This is not pessimism, but strategic realism. By preemptively contemplating adversity, the mind strips it of its power to surprise and thereby diminishes its capacity to unsettle. The psychological shock of unexpected difficulty often inflicts more damage than the difficulty itself. When events violate our expectations, we experience not only the practical consequences of the situation, but also an additional layer of emotional upheaval. Anger arises from the belief that something unjust has occurred. Despair emerges from the assumption that life was obligated to be easier. In contrast, when adversity has been mentally rehearsed, its arrival is met not with outrage, but with recognition. The mind responds, "This is precisely the kind of event I prepared for," and immediately begins to implement the strategies it has already considered. This form of preparation transforms adversity from an ambush into a challenge that, while unwelcome, is not entirely unfamiliar. The Stoic practitioner does not dwell morbidly on worst-case scenarios. Rather, he acquaints himself with their possibility so that his composure is not contingent upon their absence. He understands that human beings are prone to error, that institutions are fragile, that health is transient, and that fortune is notoriously fickle. Such awareness inoculates the mind against the corrosive shock of disillusionment, allowing one to navigate hardship with a steadier hand. Morning meditation provides the ideal arena for this rehearsal because It allows one to visualize potential trials without the immediate pressure of responding to them. In this reflective state, you may calmly consider how you would react if a colleague were to insult you, if a plan were to collapse, if an unforeseen expense were to arise, or if a trusted individual were to disappoint you. By walking through these scenarios mentally, you pre-construct responses that are measured, rational, and aligned with your principles. When a similar situation materializes in reality, your mind recognizes the pattern and retrieves the prepared response with far less turmoil than if it were improvising under stress. This practice also exposes the often exaggerated nature of our fears. When contemplated in the abstract, adversity appears monstrous and insurmountable. Yet when you analyze it deliberately, breaking it down into its practical components and examining your actual capacity to respond, you frequently discover that what you feared was not the event itself, but the vague and inflated image of it that your imagination had constructed. Through repeated exposure and meditation, these specters lose their mystique, revealing themselves as manageable, if uncomfortable, facets of ordinary life. Preparing for adversity also requires an examination of one's own vulnerabilities. It is insufficient to merely imagine external threats. One must also identify the internal weaknesses that could magnify their impact. Impatience, pride, attachment to reputation, excessive desire for comfort. These are the fissures through which hardship exerts its greatest pressure. A person who cannot tolerate criticism will suffer disproportionately when confronted with it. One who equates self-worth with financial stability will be devastated by economic setbacks. Morning reflection allows you to identify these precarious attachments and gradually loosen their grip, reducing the leverage that misfortune holds over your emotional equilibrium. Such preparation cultivates a mindset of voluntary responsibility. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin to ask, "How shall I conduct myself in the face of this?" The former question implies victimhood and invites resentment. The latter affirms agency and directs attention toward action. This subtle shift in perspective is transformative. It does not deny that adversity can be painful or unjust, but it refuses to surrender the one domain that remains under your authority, your response. Moreover, expecting adversity fosters a deeper appreciation for periods of tranquility. When you are aware that ease is temporary, you experience it with a heightened sense of gratitude rather than complacency. You do not squander calm moments in careless indulgence. You use them to reinforce your character, to cultivate relationships, and to prepare resources, both material and psychological, that may be required when circumstances become less forgiving. This orientation toward preparedness does not diminish joy. It refines it by removing the illusion of permanence that so often leads to negligence. There is also a moral dimension to anticipating hardship. A person who has reflected on adversity is less likely to react with cruelty or panic when under pressure. He has already examined his principles in hypothetical crises and has committed to upholding them even when doing so is inconvenient. In this way, morning meditation becomes a rehearsal not only for endurance but for integrity. You decide in advance that you will not resort to deception when desperate. To focus only on what is within your control is to liberate the mind from the exhausting and futile labor of attempting to govern what was never entrusted to it. Human suffering is rarely born from events themselves. It emerges from the insistence that reality conform to personal desire. When individuals anchor their peace of mind to outcomes, opinions, or circumstances beyond their authority, they effectively surrender their emotional stability to forces that neither recognize nor respect their expectations. The Stoic discipline of distinguishing between what is controllable and what is not represents one of the most formidable psychological instruments available to a rational being. It demands a ruthless honesty for it requires one to admit that the majority of what transpires in life, other people's actions, the shifting tides of fortune, the verdicts of public opinion, the inevitability of aging and mortality exists entirely outside personal jurisdiction. Yet within this stark admission lies an unexpected sanctuary, the realization that there remains a domain that no external force can penetrate without consent, the domain of judgment. Intention and response. Each morning presents a decisive opportunity to reaffirm this boundary. In meditation, before the day disperses your attention across 1,000 trivialities, you may calmly inventory the responsibilities that genuinely belong to you. Your thoughts, your choices, your effort, your adherence to principle, these are yours to command. The reactions of others, the ultimate success of your endeavors, the unpredictable convergence of external events, these remain forever beyond your reach. To blur this distinction is to condemn yourself to perpetual agitation, for you will be striving to regulate what cannot be regulated. Consider the common habit of measuring self-worth through external validation. A person who believes that his value is determined by praise or recognition places his emotional equilibrium in the hands of strangers. Their approval becomes a currency that fluctuates without warning, and his sense of identity rises and falls with it. By contrast, the individual who has internalized the principle of control anchors his self-assessment in criteria that lie entirely within his governance. Did I act with integrity? Did I apply my faculties diligently? Did I refrain from actions that contradict my principles? These questions can be answered without consulting the volatile tribunal of public opinion. This disciplined focus also dismantles the corrosive habit of resentment. Much of human bitterness arises from the belief that others should behave in accordance with one's own standards. When they inevitably fail to do so, anger is interpreted as a justified response to perceived injustice. Yet if one accepts that other people's choices reside outside personal control, their misconduct, while perhaps regrettable, ceases to be a personal affront demanding emotional retribution. You are free to judge their actions as misguided or harmful, but you are no longer compelled to poison your own mind in response to them. Morning reflection serves as a rehearsal for this detachment. You may remind yourself that throughout the day you will encounter individuals driven by ignorance, self-interest, or impulsivity. Their words may be careless, their decisions short-sighted. Yet none of this grants them the authority to dictate your internal state. By anticipating their imperfections, you prepare yourself to respond with composure rather than indignation. Their behavior becomes an external occurrence, no more capable of injuring your character than a sudden change in weather. The discipline of focusing on what is within your control also clarifies the proper allocation of effort. Without this clarity, people scatter their energy across concerns that yield no tangible influence. They ruminate over past events that cannot be altered, speculate anxiously about future scenarios that may never materialize, and obsess over the opinions of those whose judgments they cannot revise. This diffusion of attention leaves them fatigued and ineffective. Much like a general who disperses his forces across terrain, he neither needs nor can defend. When you restrict your concern to controllable domains, your actions acquire precision. You invest your time in cultivating skills, refining your character, and executing tasks that lie directly within your capacity to effect. Instead of lamenting the unpredictability of outcomes, you concentrate on the excellence of your effort. This shift in emphasis transforms work from a gamble dependent on external results into a deliberate exercise of personal virtue. Success becomes defined not by whether circumstances favored you, but by whether you conducted yourself with competence and integrity. Such a mindset also renders you less susceptible to despair in the face of failure. When outcomes are treated as the ultimate measure of worth, their unfavorable turn appears catastrophic. Yet if you have already accepted that outcomes reside outside your full control, their arrival, whether triumphant or disappointing, carries less emotional turbulence. You evaluate your performance based on the criteria you can actually govern: preparation, discipline, adherence to principle. If these were upheld, then even an unfavorable result cannot logically be interpreted as a personal collapse. This focus does not breed passivity, as some mistakenly believe. On the contrary, it encourages decisive action precisely because it eliminates the paralyzing fear of uncontrollable variables. A person obsessed with perfect outcomes may hesitate to act, fearing the embarrassment of failure or the unpredictability of others' reactions. The Stoic, having already relinquished attachment to these uncontrollable elements, is free to act vigorously where his influence is real. He directs his will toward the process rather than the prize, confident that the moral worth of his actions does not hinge upon the whims of chance. Morning meditation reinforces this orientation by providing a daily reminder of the transient and unstable nature of external circumstances. You may visualize plans unraveling despite careful preparation, or recognition being withheld despite diligent work. By confronting these possibilities in a controlled mental environment, you immunize yourself against the shock that would otherwise accompany them. You reaffirm that your tranquility does not depend upon securing every desired outcome, but upon maintaining mastery over your own judgments. This discipline also cultivates humility. Recognizing the limits of your control reveals the extent to which your life is interwoven with forces beyond your design, the labor of countless individuals, the accidents of history, the unpredictable interplay of natural and social phenomena. Such awareness tempers arrogance and replaces it with a sober respect for the complexity of the world. You cease to attribute every success solely to personal merit, just as you cease to interpret every setback as a personal injustice. Language, once again, plays a crucial role in maintaining this focus. The way you frame events internally determines whether you perceive them as violations of your control or as neutral occurrences. To say, "This should not have happened," implies an expectation of authority over events that were never yours to command. To say, "This has happened. How shall I respond?" preserves your agency while acknowledging reality's independence. To act with duty rather than comfort or emotion is to elevate one's conduct above the shifting terrain of impulse and preference, anchoring behavior in principles that remain stable even when circumstances are not. Most individuals, whether they recognize it or not, are governed by a silent hierarchy of motivations in which comfort sits at the summit. They rise when they feel inclined, speak when it pleases them, exert effort only when enthusiasm is present, and withdraw the moment difficulty threatens their ease. Such a pattern produces a life that appears effortless in brief moments, yet remains fundamentally fragile, incapable of sustaining integrity under pressure. Duty, by contrast, is indifferent to comfort. It does not consult the body's fatigue or the mind's reluctance before issuing its demands. It represents a higher allegiance to reason, to moral obligation, to the role one occupies within the larger structure of society. To orient one's actions around duty is to accept that personal convenience is not the ultimate arbiter of behavior. It is to acknowledge that there exist tasks which must be performed, words which must be spoken, and standards which must be upheld regardless of whether one feels inspired or inclined. Morning meditation provides the essential framework for reinforcing this hierarchy before the day's temptations begin their subtle persuasion. In the quiet hours, when distractions have not yet begun their assault, one may contemplate the responsibilities that define one's station, whether as a parent, a citizen, a colleague, or simply as a rational being endowed with the capacity for ethical judgment. By enumerating these roles and their associated obligations, The mind is reminded that its purpose is not merely to pursue pleasure or avoid discomfort, but to fulfill the functions that reason has assigned to it. Acting from emotion alone, subjects conduct to volatility. Emotions, while natural and often informative, are inherently transient and frequently disproportionate to reality. Anger surges in response to perceived insult. Fear magnifies the likelihood of harm. Desire exaggerates the value of fleeting pleasures. When actions are dictated by these fluctuations, consistency becomes impossible. A person may be generous in one moment and callous in the next, courageous when emboldened by approval, yet cowardly when confronted with solitude. Such inconsistency erodes trust, both in the eyes of others and within one's own self-assessment. Duty, on the other hand, introduces a stabilizing principle. It asks not, "What do I feel like doing?" but rather, "What is required of me according to reason and obligation?" This shift in inquiry transforms decision-making from a reaction to internal turbulence into a chimesis, into a deliberate alignment with a predetermined standard. The individual who operates under this framework does not need to consult his mood before acting with honesty, fulfilling commitments, or exercising restraint. These behaviors become non-negotiable, embedded in his conception of what it means to live rightly. Comfort exerts its influence in subtle and insidious ways. It whispers that a difficult conversation can be postponed, that a challenging task can be deferred until motivation mysteriously appears, that a moral compromise is acceptable because confronting it would be inconvenient. Over time, these minor concessions accumulate, gradually reshaping character into something pliable and unreliable. What begins as a single act of avoidance becomes a habit of evasion, until the individual finds himself incapable of confronting even moderate hardship without distress. Morning reflection serves as a countermeasure to this erosion. By anticipating the day's likely discomforts, tedious labor, social friction, unforeseen complications, you prepare yourself to meet them, not with surprise or resentment, but with acceptance. You remind yourself that the presence of discomfort does not constitute a valid argument against fulfilling your obligations. In doing so, you deprive comfort of its persuasive power. It can no longer masquerade as a rational justification for an action. Acting from duty also refines one's relationship with pleasure. It does not require the rejection of all enjoyment, but it insists that pleasure occupy a subordinate position within the hierarchy of values. When pleasure is treated as the ultimate goal, it becomes tyrannical, dictating choices that prioritize immediate gratification over long-term well-being or ethical consistency. By subordinating pleasure to duty, you retain the capacity to enjoy life's agreeable moments without allowing them to dictate your decisions. You partake in comfort when it is available, yet you do not depend upon it to function. Emotion, too, finds its proper place within this structure. Stoic philosophy does not demand the eradication of feeling, an endeavor both impossible and undesirable. Instead, it advocates for the governance of emotion through reason. Emotions may inform you of your initial reactions, but they are not granted the authority to determine your final actions. If anger arises, you acknowledge its presence, examine its cause, and then decide based on duty whether its expression would serve justice or merely gratify wounded pride. If fear emerges, you assess whether it signals genuine danger or merely discomfort at the prospect of effort or uncertainty. This discipline becomes particularly crucial in moments of interpersonal conflict. When insulted or provoked, the emotional impulse is to retaliate, to defend one's ego through equally cutting words or hostile gestures. Yet duty may dictate a different course, perhaps silence, perhaps measured clarification, perhaps the deliberate choice to disengage from a fruitless exchange. By deferring to duty rather than emotion, you prevent transient feelings from dictating actions that could produce lasting damage to relationships or reputation. The cultivation of duty-centered action also fosters resilience. A person who relies on emotion for motivation will find his productivity and moral consistency fluctuating with his mood. On days when enthusiasm is absent or discouragement is present, he may accomplish little and later regret his inertia. The individual guided by duty, however, continues to act even when emotional rewards are absent. He understands that meaningful endeavors often involve prolonged periods of monotony or frustration, and he accepts these as inherent components of worthwhile pursuits. Morning meditation reinforces this resilience by providing a daily rehearsal of the mindset required to subordinate comfort and emotion. You may visualize yourself performing tasks while fatigued, responding calmly to provocation, or persisting in effort despite a lack of immediate gratification. These mental simulations reduce the novelty of such situations when they occur in reality, making it easier to default to duty rather than to the more seductive pull of ease or emotional release. There is also a profound ethical significance in prioritizing duty. Societies function on the implicit assumption that individuals will fulfill certain responsibilities, regardless of personal inclination. Parents are expected to care for their children even when exhausted. Professionals are trusted to perform their roles even when bored. Citizens are relied upon to adhere to laws even when doing so is inconvenient. When individuals abandon duty in favor of comfort, these social contracts fray, leading to instability and mistrust. By committing yourself to duty, you contribute to the preservation of the very structures that allow collective life to operate. This orientation toward duty ultimately reshapes identity itself. Instead of defining yourself by what you feel or by what brings you comfort, you begin to define yourself by the standards you uphold and the responsibilities you honor. Your sense of self-worth becomes intertwined with your reliability, your consistency, and your willingness to act rightly, even when doing so is difficult or unrewarding. This form of self-respect is more durable. To strengthen the mind daily through discipline is to recognize that mental fortitude is not an inheritance but a construction, erected gradually through repeated acts of conscious effort. Just as the body deteriorates without regular exertion, the mind too decays into lethargy, impulsivity, and fragility when left untrained. Discipline, therefore, is not a punitive concept imposed from the outside. It is the scaffolding upon which a resilient and sovereign intellect is built. Every morning presents a choice between indulgence and cultivation. The undisciplined mind seeks immediate gratification. It lingers in bed beyond necessity, drifts into aimless thought, or seeks distraction before clarity has had the opportunity to take root. These small concessions appear harmless in isolation, yet they accumulate into habits that gradually erode mental sharpness and self-command. A mind accustomed to indulgence becomes intolerant of discomfort, impatient with complexity, and easily unsettled by the ordinary frictions of life. Discipline interrupts this downward drift. It introduces structure where chaos would otherwise reign and replaces caprice with intention. By committing to morning meditation, reflective journaling, or any form of deliberate cognitive training, you establish a daily ritual that reminds the mind of its obligations. This repetition is not redundant. It is foundational. The mind, like any instrument, requires regular tuning. Without it, even the most gifted intellect loses its clarity, becoming distorted by accumulated distractions and unexamined impulses. There is a tendency in modern life to equate discipline with severity, as though it were synonymous with joylessness or repression. Yet true discipline is not the denial of pleasure. It is the intelligent sequencing of it. It ensures that immediate desires do not sabotage long-term well-being. The disciplined individual may still enjoy rest, entertainment, and comfort, but he does so after fulfilling his essential responsibilities, not in place of them. This order of operations preserves both productivity and enjoyment. preventing pleasure from degenerating into escapism. Daily mental discipline also cultivates consistency, a trait more valuable than sporadic brilliance. Many individuals experience bursts of motivation or clarity, yet their lack of routine prevents these moments from coalescing into sustained progress. Discipline transforms isolated flashes of insight into a continuous current of improvement. By engaging in reflective practices each morning, you ensure that your principles are not merely admired in theory, but reinforced in practice. You revisit them, test them against new experiences, and refine them in light of emerging understanding that the mind's resistance to discipline is both predictable and instructive. It will invent rationalizations for postponing reflection, suggest that today's circumstances are exceptional, or claim that one day without practice will make no difference. These arguments, though persuasive in the moment, reveal the mind's preference for ease over excellence. To ignore them and proceed with your routine regardless is itself a training exercise. Each time you act in defiance of this internal resistance, you reinforce the neural and psychological pathways associated with self-command. Moreover, discipline sharpens awareness of time's irreversible passage. When you commit to daily mental cultivation, you become acutely conscious of how each neglected day represents a lost opportunity for refinement. This awareness discourages complacency and fosters a sense of urgency that is not frantic but purposeful. You begin to view each morning not as an interchangeable unit in an endless sequence, but as a unique and finite resource that must be used wisely. The benefits of sustained discipline extend beyond the immediate act of reflection. They permeate every aspect of life, influencing decision-making, emotional regulation, and interpersonal conduct. A mind trained to adhere to routine becomes less susceptible to impulsive behavior. It develops the capacity to pause, to evaluate, and to choose deliberately rather than react automatically. This pause, often only a fraction of a second, is the crucible in which wisdom is forged, separating thoughtful action from regretful reaction. Discipline also fosters intellectual humility. By engaging in daily practices that expose your own cognitive biases, recurring anxieties, and habitual errors, you are repeatedly reminded of your fallibility. This recognition tempers arrogance and encourages continuous learning. The disciplined mind does not assume that it has reached a final state of perfection. It understands that maintenance and improvement are lifelong obligations. Each day's practice becomes both a reminder of past shortcomings and a commitment to future growth. There is an accumulative power in small, repeated acts that is often underestimated. A single morning of meditation may yield only subtle insights, and a single entry in a journal may appear trivial. Yet over months and years, these modest efforts compound into a formidable repository of self-knowledge and emotional stability. You begin to notice patterns in your behavior, recurring triggers of stress, and strategies that consistently produce clarity. This longitudinal perspective is available only to those who have been disciplined enough to create a record of their own mental evolution. Furthermore, daily discipline creates a buffer against external chaos. The world is inherently unpredictable. Plans unravel, relationships shift, and unforeseen crises emerge without warning. In such an environment, a mind that lacks internal structure is easily overwhelmed. The disciplined mind, however, possesses an anchor. Its routines provide a sense of continuity, even when external circumstances are turbulent. No matter how chaotic the day becomes, the knowledge that you began it with deliberate reflection reinforces a sense of order and control. The act of returning to discipline each morning also carries symbolic weight. It is a daily reaffirmation of your commitment to self-mastery. In choosing to engage in mentally demanding practices when easier alternatives are readily available, you send a clear message to yourself about your priorities. You demonstrate, through action rather than intention, that the cultivation of character takes precedence over the seduction of idleness. This repeated demonstration gradually reshapes your self-concept. You cease to see yourself as someone who occasionally strives for improvement, and begin to identify as a person for whom discipline is a defining trait. Discipline, when practiced consistently, also refines one's capacity for focus. Modern environments are engineered to fracture attention, presenting an endless stream of notifications, headlines, and trivial diversions. Each interruption weakens the mind's ability to sustain concentration on complex or demanding tasks. Morning practices that require sustained attention, such as meditation, deep reading, or analytical writing, serve as counterweights to this fragmentation. They retrain the mind to remain with a single line of thought without succumbing to the urge for constant novelty. It is important to recognize that discipline is not a destination, but a process. There will be mornings when fatigue is heavier than usual, when motivation is scarce, or when circumstances disrupt your routine. In these moments, the measure of discipline is not perfection, but persistence. Even a shortened or simplified practice preserves the continuity of habit and prevents regression into complete neglect. The objective is not to perform flawlessly each day, but to refuse to abandon the commitment altogether. Over years, the individual who has adhered to daily mental discipline becomes markedly different from the one who has not. His reaction